In a grand yet quiet mansion nestled in a small American town, the silence was deafening. The once vibrant house, filled with laughter and the scent of home-cooked meals, now echoed only the ticking of an old grandfather clock. Mr. Harold Thompson, a retired school principal in his 70s, sat in a leather armchair, watching the flicker of firelight dance on the walls. His eyes, though kind, carried the weight of years and unspoken worries. His son, Daniel, a brilliant and accomplished software developer, had just walked away from yet another conversation about marriage. It wasn't the first time. Every time Harold gently brought it up, perhaps suggesting someone from church or an old friend's daughter, Daniel would stiffen, then shut it down. "I don't need love, Dad. I have my work, my peace." "That's enough," he had said that evening, his tone firm, almost defensive. He didn't sound angry, just closed off, as if a part of him had long since been sealed shut. Harold didn't reply. He only nodded as Daniel left the room, footsteps fading down the hallway to his bedroom, where the door quietly clicked shut. Left alone once again, Harold's gaze drifted to the mantel above the fireplace. There sat a photo, faded but precious, of his late wife, Margaret, holding baby Daniel, both smiling under the golden sun of some long-ago summer. He picked up the photo with trembling hands and smiled sadly. Margaret had always believed in the power of love. She had raised Daniel to be kind, thoughtful, and open-hearted. But somewhere along the road, between heartbreaks, betrayals, and the growing pressure of success, Daniel had built walls. Walls Harold now feared were too tall for anyone to climb. "He's forgotten how to feel, Margaret," Harold whispered, brushing a thumb across the glass. "Maybe, it's time I remind him." In that moment, something shifted in Harold's heart. He had spent his whole life teaching others how to learn, but now, he realized, it was time to teach Daniel how to feel again. Not with lectures or pressure, but with something deeper, something that could only be discovered where true kindness lived. And in that quiet flicker of resolve, an extraordinary idea was born, one that would soon change both of their lives forever. The park buzzed with life, children playing, joggers passing by, vendors calling out for coffee and pretzels. But on one worn-out bench near a willow tree, an old man sat quietly, almost invisible to the crowd. Harold, in a patched coat and old shoes, looked every bit the part of a beggar. He held no sign. He asked for nothing. He simply smiled, nodded at strangers, and watched the world go by. Most people hurried past him, their eyes fixed on phones or destinations, never once meeting his gaze. To them, he was part of the scenery, just another forgotten soul in the city's rhythm. But Harold wasn't really homeless. This was a choice. A quiet mission. He was watching. Listening. Waiting. Then came Emily. The first time she noticed him, she paused. Just for a second. Then she returned the next day. And the next. She was a nurse, always in scrubs, always carrying 2 sandwiches, one for herself, and one she gently handed to Harold without ceremony. "No one should eat alone every day," she said the first time, her voice soft but full of care. Harold was taken aback. She didn't ask questions. She didn't pity him. She simply shared a meal and a moment. Day after day, Emily sat beside him during her lunch break. They talked about the weather, the birds in the trees, the stories hidden in passing faces. Over time, Harold asked little things: what brought her joy, what she hoped for, what hurt she carried. He learned about her dream of opening a free clinic one day. About the man who once promised forever but disappeared when things got hard. About how she still believed in kindness, even when life had been cruel. And Harold listened. Really listened. Not as a beggar, but as a father. A man searching for someone who could see past the surface, someone who still knew how to love without judgment or expectation. The more he watched her, the more he saw everything he wished for his son. She was exactly the kind of woman Daniel had given up believing existed. And so, Harold smiled to himself, holding the sandwich she'd brought that day, knowing that maybe, just maybe, the right heart had finally found its way to that quiet park bench. The wind whispered through the trees as golden leaves danced around the park benches. Daniel had come to the park seeking a moment of silence, a brief escape from the cold detachment of his daily routine. But what he saw stopped him in his tracks. Across the pathway, near the fountain, sat his father, Harold, dressed in ragged layers, hunched slightly, a cane resting by his knee. And beside him sat a young woman, laughing softly as she handed him a paper cup of coffee. Daniel blinked, certain he was mistaken. But it was him. Heart racing with confusion and a twinge of embarrassment, Daniel marched across the grass. "Dad? What are you doing here dressed like that?" he demanded, eyes darting around to see who else might be watching. Harold turned to him calmly, completely unfazed. "Meeting people who see hearts instead of clothes," he replied, his voice steady, even amused. Emily stood, clearly startled by the confrontation but maintaining her grace. "Is everything all right?" she asked gently. Harold smiled up at her. "Yes, dear. Thank you for the coffee. We'll talk again soon." Sensing the moment was personal, Emily nodded. "Of course. Take care." With one last glance at Daniel, more curious than judgmental, she walked away down the path. Daniel stood frozen, trying to make sense of what he'd just witnessed. "Why, Dad?" he asked, his voice softer now. "What is all this?" Harold rose slowly, brushing the wrinkles from his coat. "You've spent so long building walls around yourself that you've forgotten how to let someone in. I wanted to show you there are still people in this world who care, not about what you have, but who you are." Daniel looked toward where Emily had disappeared. "You've been pretending to be homeless, to find someone for me?" "No," Harold said. "To remind you that real connection still exists." "But yes. I hoped you'd notice her." Daniel fell quiet, his chest tightening in a way he hadn't felt in years. Maybe his father was crazy. Or maybe, just maybe, he'd done something extraordinary. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel wondered, what if love hadn't abandoned him? What if he'd just stopped looking in the right places? The cafe was small, tucked between a bookstore and a flower shop, with soft music playing and the comforting smell of cinnamon in the air. Daniel sat nervously at a corner table, fingers drumming the edge of his cup. He wasn't used to feeling uncertain, especially not about something as simple as coffee. But this wasn't simple. This was Emily. She arrived with that same quiet warmth, the kind that didn't try too hard yet somehow disarmed you completely. He stood to greet her, a little too formal, but she just smiled and said, "Relax. It's coffee, not a job interview." He chuckled, finally allowing himself to breathe. "I wanted to say I'm sorry," he said once they Saturday, "for the park. For my tone. For not understanding what you were doing with my father." Emily tilted her head, thoughtful. "No apology needed. You were protecting someone you love. That says a lot." The conversation flowed easier than he expected. What started as polite small talk turned into deeper questions, about childhood, dreams, disappointments. Daniel found himself laughing, really laughing, for the first time in months. She didn't flinch at his honesty. She didn't try to impress him. She just listened, and when she spoke, it was always from the heart. They met again a few days later for a walk, then again for lunch. Each time, Daniel discovered something new, about her, about himself. He began to realize how numb he had become to real connection, how many times he'd confused attention for affection, status for substance. One crisp evening as they sipped tea on a bench outside the cafe, he asked her what she thought of his father's experiment. She smiled, eyes soft with understanding. "Your father, he's wise. Sometimes it takes pretending to be poor to find what's truly rich. The words hit him deeper than he expected. Looking at her, simple, honest, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with appearances, Daniel finally understood what his father had been trying to show him all along. Love wasn't something you chased. It was something you recognized when your heart was finally still enough to see it. And for the first time in years, Daniel let his guard down and allowed that truth to settle in. The early spring breeze carried the scent of blooming cherry blossoms as soft petals floated down over a serene lake garden. Birds sang gently in the trees, and sunlight shimmered on the water's surface like scattered diamonds. It was a small gathering, just family, close friends, and the sound of love settling gently into place. Daniel stood beneath an archway of white flowers, his eyes fixed on Emily as she walked toward him. There were no grand gestures, no lavish displays, only the quiet, powerful connection between two souls who had truly seen one another. When they took each other's hands, it was as though the world around them faded away. Their vows were simple, heartfelt, and honest, words that carried the weight of everything they'd been through, and the hope of everything to come. And when the officiant finally pronounced them husband and wife, applause broke out, light and joyful. Off to the side, Harold stood with a gentle smile, no longer in disguise. Dressed in a soft gray suit, he held a framed photo of Margaret, his late wife, close to his heart. As tears welled in his eyes, he whispered to the photo, "He found her, Margaret. He finally found someone who sees him the way you saw me." As the guests began to mingle, Daniel walked over and pulled his father into a deep, silent hug. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, with his voice thick with emotion, Daniel whispered, "Thank you for showing me how to love again." Harold, smiling through his tears, placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Sometimes," he said softly, "the poorest man is the richest, when he has love in his heart." The lake sparkled behind them, a perfect mirror of the peace now resting in their lives. What began as a father's unconventional act of love had come full circle. Not just mending a wounded heart, but opening it wide to something beautiful and lasting. And as Harold stood there, watching his son laugh with his new wife, he knew Margaret was smiling too, because sometimes, love takes the long way home.